we talked last night, so I think we have a pretty good idea of where this is going to go, right?
Yes.
Any comments, questions before we get going here?
No, just shout to everyone in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm excited for this show. I feel like me and Dan are almost like the same person in a way, where we both, I feel like, learn things almost at the same time. So,
you seem to be a year in front of me, but go on, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, we're always like right next to each other.
Yeah.
So whenever I'm learning something, Dan's either right behind me or right ahead of me. So I always really love these conversations that we have because it feels like we're learning together.
Yeah.
Our respective communities are learning together. That's all really a huge positive, and I see people in the chat, fellow comrades, mentioned that, obviously I'm not indigenous. This is a conversation that indigenous comrades would be centered in.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that this is just the introduction to that process, both for you and for myself. I hope that we engage more with indigenous comrades going in the future. But I know you've said this in the show already, but this is very much an introductory or course or class, so to speak, of what is decolonial Marxism. I'm a comrade that is still new to this in terms of decolonial Marxism, but has been organizing in real life for a few years now. So I can at least add that level of experience to this, I think.
You're right on. This is definitely meant to be a jumping off point. Neither of us, I would consider experts in decolonial Marxism, but we're hopefully going to be drawing attention to those who want to find those kinds of resources and drawing attention to those kinds of folks and sources and resources. Absolutely.
And it's hard for me to see the chat while I'm doing this, obviously. So if there's any good questions, Dan, that you see in the chat that you think I should answer, please feel free to add that into the mix, so to speak.
Sounds good. Well, Matthew, you ready to hit the road with this thing? Do the thing?
Yes, let's do the thing.
Well, let's do that. And welcome again. All right, great. This is the Dan Simpson Show with Dan Simpson and my guest today, Matthew J. Hunter, friend of the stream, champion of the stream, returning champion, mayhaps championist of the stream. You may have been my most recurring guest. So welcome back, Matthew. How are you doing today, homie? What's up?
Good, comrade. It's another year in the struggle. It's 2024. It's still kind of wild to me when I put down the date. I'm one of those people for sure. It takes me a few months to get used to it. It's election year, so the contradictions are heightening. I love it. The struggle continues. And it's one of those things where obviously we're going to get into it in this discussion is that the balance of forces, the material conditions, overall landscape has shifted so much, I think, since a lot of us have started being organizers, activists in leftist spaces. There's a few of us that are out there in the chat that have probably been in here for decades, but most of us are like us. I would say that it's like Trump years, maybe towards the end of Obama, where we started getting active. And I think it's time to sort of reassess where we're at, have sort of a collective town hall of the left, so to speak, on where we're at, what is to be done, who needs to be kicked out of these spaces too. I think that is a little bit of the discussion as well, which we will get into.
Awesome. So today I wanted to bring you on to talk about a couple different topics. Our scope for the chat is to give a brief introduction for those who don't know anything about decolonial Marxism, hopefully deepen folks' knowledge of decolonial Marxism if they are somewhat aware of it. Obviously, we're not going to approach the level of expertise, as we mentioned before. And we're going to talk about the Patsocs as well, the patriotic socialists, and that's going to be sort of our vehicle for exploring the topic. You had a debate with a Patsoc, and they may take issue with this term, but we'll get into why we consider them Patsocs later in our talk. We're going to talk generally about Patsocs or patriotic socialists, and then more specifically the Midwestern Marxists, and you had a debate with one of them about last week, and his name is Noah Kratchvik. Is that his name?
Allegedly.
Yeah. And I caught about 30 minutes of that last night, and then I wanted to die. But let's do really quickly talk about you just a little bit here. Matthew, you are on the Twitter. Folks, you guys know what Twitter is? Twitter's great. Twitter, Matthew Hunter MCR, and you got a couple projects listed here. Additionally, you have a YouTube channel, History of Socialism and Trending Now Network, and I'll drop that link in the chat for everybody right there. There it goes. It's playing your chat with Rick from Decolonized Buffalo, who we'll talk about as well later. All right, so that's that. Matthew, what else do we need to know about you, homie?
I just got reelected as, my position slightly shifted. I'm now the executive secretary of the Southeast Los Angeles Communist Party USA Club. What else? I've been organizing for a few years now. I was originally in DSA back in 2018-ish, 2017 maybe at the earliest, probably more 2018. Left DSA in 2020, late 2020, and joined CPUSA. I'm a white settler, so obviously there's that level of bias that I need to at least put on the table here as we talk about colonialism. You know, I'm non-indigenous, communist. I mean, there's not much else to say. You know, I hope that you know, for what I see, that most people in the chat have seen me before, so that's good to see. For those that haven't, definitely check out, like Dan said, my Twitter, my pinned tweet. It shows a lot of the articles I've written as well. Definitely recommend checking out more of my written work than some of my video work.
Awesome. And we've spoken in the past, and I think one of our first talks, Matthew, we brought up the Patsocs, and I remember you told me, "Oh, well, they're Strasser rights," and I was at a part of my own historical education where I didn't know what that meant. So I'm looking forward to getting into that.
Yeah,
so
that's
Matt,
about a year or two ago now. Things have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I've actually become a Marxist in that time. I've done, you know, some of the study, you know, enough study where I consider myself a Marxist now, and I understand what that actually means. And we're going to get into that too. But let's lead into this. Folks, we're going to engage in what some people might consider to be leftist infighting. You may not think it is, and that's fine. That's good. Because the thing is this, communist writers and leaders have often engaged in polemics. Polemics are speech or pieces of writing expressing a strongly critical attack on a controversial opinion about someone or something. A polemic, and we engage in these polemics, and communist writers and leaders and thought intellectuals have engaged in polemics against their ideological opponents from the beginning. For instance, Marx and Engels, they published polemical works. Engels' work Anti-Dühring served as a polemic against Jugend Dühring. Marx's critique of the Gotha program, am I saying that wrong? I've always wondered, is against Ferdinand Lassalle. Lenin published The Proletarian Revolution and The Renegade Kautsky, notably directed against Karl Kautsky, the renegade. And other such works, such as State and Revolution, attacked figures including Bernstein. Therefore, so-called leftist infighting is nothing unfamiliar to Marxists, and is, you could say, an important part of our struggle for arguing the position of consistent Marxism, for consistent Marxist analysis, in order to win over the minds of intellectuals and of the working and oppressed classes. I found this tweet that I thought to be really important and helpful, maybe to illustrate this, from Johnny Socialism. The idea that communists condemning people is a purity fetish betrays ignorance of Marx and Engels. I'm sorry, but you're telling me that these salty-ass men who wrote endlessly to each other, dunking on bad thinkers, would tell people to play nice? Go read the text, Dorcas. What do you think, Matthew?
I mean, I think, it's one thing people to so grossly think that, like, someone like myself going after Midwestern Marxs or Jackson Hinkle is quote unquote leftist infighting. Because like we're not in the same group. So like there's no infighting, so to speak. We're not within the same organization. And it's funny because comrades at Decolonize Buffalo and the International Anti-Colonial Institute just did like a reading of Combat Liberalism by Mao. And I just want to read a quote real fast, okay? Yeah. It's in the first page. It's only like a couple pages, to be honest, as well. So everyone should read it. But in the first page, like third paragraph from the top, let things slide for the sake of peace and friendship when a person has clearly gone wrong, and refrain from principled argument because he is an old acquaintance, a fellow townsman, a schoolmate, a close friend, a loved one, an old colleague, an old subordinate, or to touch on the matter lightly instead of going into it thoroughly, as to keep on good terms. The result is that both the organization and the individual are harmed. This is one type of liberalism. Marxists and communists have always, and if you want to do like more broadly speaking, like the left, right? If you want to include like anarchists and other groups, right? They've always had very strenuous internal struggles, ideological struggles. The fight against revisionism, reformism, tailism, these are important struggles internally within the movement. And obviously we're going to get into it later, but the struggle against chauvinism as well is a very important internal struggle within the movement. And to discount these leads to vast distortions of communism, vast distortions of Marxism, a vulgarization of it, and ultimately leads to revisionism. And that can get into a whole spiral of things. So you can get something as mild, I mean, use the term mild as politely as I can, to people like Bernstein and Kantowski, right? But you can go to the farthest edge of that for like Strasser, who definitely did use Marxist terminology in his rhetoric, co-opted that. Mussolini, I mean, obviously was a socialist, and co-opted socialist terminology when he became a fascist. So, like, the idea that we can't sort of have these internal struggles against possible revisionism, distortion, chauvinism, whatever it may be, because we need to have left unity, to me is just one, ahistorical, and two, is actually dangerous for organizations and spaces that people that organize in real life. If we're not talking about online spaces, right? We're talking about people in chat rooms or on live streams in the chats. We're talking about real life organization, people meeting in a room trying to do actual things. To allow revisionism, chauvinism, these type of vulgarizations of Marxism into these spaces is extremely dangerous. And it's a growing trend amongst, I would say, the online Western left. I have not seen this really in real life. When I go to spaces in real life that are a little bit eclectic, so to speak, there's going to be Trotskyists, anarchists, Marxist-Leninists, right? There's going to be a gambit of leftists there. I don't see this level of chauvinism, revisionism in real life. It's very much an online phenomenon, in my opinion. Well,
yeah. Okay, well, let's dig in and let's try to lay a foundation so that anyone who is new to this conversation at all, they don't know maybe what decolonialism is, maybe they don't even know what Marxism is. And let's just start from the top. So what is colonization?
Colonization is a process by which foreign people come in, and not immigrate. They come in and do both internal and external processes, exploit the land, the labor, and the people of an indigenous nation or community. Obviously, we have examples, whether it be the most talked about one in media right now is Israel, and that's a good one for us to always compare to because it's a settler colonial construct like we are. And settler colonialism is different in the fact that it's a population coming to settle and expel the indigenous population, because you can't have forms of colonialism where you don't have that expulsion or genocide, so to speak, of the native population. You purely have economic exploitation to the point where they don't have sovereignty, right? Where you get like neo-colonialism. But settler colonialism is a different aspect to that. It's a different form. That's what we have in the U.S. That's what we have in occupied Palestine. That's what we did have. I'm going to use the past tense, though I would say they're still going through the process of decolonization. But we did have in South Africa, where we had a settler population come in and take over the land, claim it as their own, and then claim, in a sense, through time, indigeneity to the land. And that's a big part to this as well. We're going to see, as we go throughout this talk, that there's this common trend amongst North American Marxists, settler Marxists, where they want to wash over this settler colonial paradigm that still exists, and claim that the working class is this collective totality, that these divisions, so to speak, have been erased due to the actual colonial process. And to me, that's just one of the worst forms of chauvinism. Now, if I can, I want to read a quote from Lenin.
Yes,
a great book by Decolonized Buffalo, Lenin, Stalin on Decolonization. You get it at Midnight Books. Great collection of quotes and excerpts on both men on decolonization. One of the quotes from Self-Determination of Nations by Lenin, quote, "The socialists cannot reach their great aim of fighting against every form of national oppression. Must therefore unequivocally demand that the social democrats," which at the time were all Marxists, of the oppressing countries, of the so-called great nations in particular, should recognize and defend the right of the oppressed nations to self-determination in the political sense of the word, i.e. the right to political separation. A socialist of a great nation, or a nation possessing colonies, who does not defend this right is a chauvinist. And Marxism is a methodology of analysis, right? It's a way of analyzing the world through a material lens, through a dialectical material lens, especially. And when we talk about dialectics, I know you wanted to like sort of set the foundation. We're going all over the place. I apologize, Dan.
I'm having fun.
But dialectics is to simplify it as much as I can. It's the philosophical analysis of analyzing the quantitative to qualitative shift, analyzing the developing material forces, right? And we have to look at colonialism, settler colonialism in the U.S. As a developing force. And that's one thing where I think a lot of people get stuck in this mindset of metaphysics, sort of be a Maoist for a second, where they want to think of these things as very static. And colonialism is a process that predates the development of capitalism. I think that's another thing that a lot of Western Marxists wrap their head around. And it took me a long time, and I'll be honest, I'm still wrapping my head around it. For a long time, I thought it was more of a twin development, so to speak. That they both fed off each other, so to speak. The reality is that the colonial process that we were born into was started in the feudal class structures. And the reality is that we have this colonial process and paradigm that has existed through feudalism, or through the end of feudalism, through the entire development of capitalism. And the idea that as Marxists, we should ignore this and let it hang on as we develop into socialism, to me is very dangerous. I think as Marxists, we need to be very aware of the development of colonialism and the developing forces against that, the contradictory forces against that. because those are the forces of revolutionary potential. And I think this is a huge misstep by the Patsocs, by the MAGA communists. I know we're going to get more into it, but this idea that we're just fighting capitalism, it is not true. There's a huge class reductionist element to this. And, Marxism is not class reductionism. And I think I understand why, if you only read Marx, only read Engels, if you only read a Sum of Lenin, you can get trapped in this chauvinist, class reductionist paradigm, this vulgarization of Marxism. Even Lenin talks about this. I know you've read a lot of Lenin, Colin, in the past year or so. They talk a lot about how Marxism is not a dogmatic methodology, and it's being used dogmatically in the West. And I think we as Western Marxists, to understand Marxism as a developing methodology, we need to sort of rid ourselves of this Eurocentric, dogmatic view that, people like you already mentioned, Katowski, Bernstein, people that were fought and struggled against in the communist movement 100 years ago, that is still here, that like we haven't got rid of that. I think it's a huge indictment on us as like white Marxists in the West, that we have not been able to get rid of this struggle. We continually have this. I've been ranting for a bit. I know you have a ton of questions. I apologize.
Oh, perfect. I think we're touching on a lot of different things, and we're going to get back to some of those things as well. So we're covering ground that eventually we will cover. So now that we've briefly touched on what colonization is, what is decolonization?
Decolonization is also a process. And there's indigenous comrades in the chat, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
When I make this comparison or make this an analogy. But I know I told you this one last night, Dan, that when we put, with Marxism being a methodology and decolonization being a process, when we combine the two, it becomes a process which we use a certain methodology. So when we're saying decolonization, a very broad thing. The essay I gave you, was it Tuck and Yang from, the Ohio State University, I believe, called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Definitely should go read. It's only like 40 pages. Really good, though.
Yes.
And this is a common issue you see when you start reading indigenous comrades. Really recommend Taiki Alfred, 2 books in particular, Why I See Indigenous Pathways to Action and Freedom, and then Peace, Power, and Righteousness and Indigenous Manifesto. These are 2 that I've gone through. Really recommend them. But the struggle to determine what is decolonization, what is this process, is a struggle in and of itself, from what I understand. You obviously have the academic, liberal arts sort of way of thinking about it, right? Then you have the real life, on the ground organizers that are working through decolonization, right? And I think we have to understand that when we talk about decolonization, decolonial Marxism, we're adding a specific methodology, specify what type of decolonial process we want to go through, right? So as we already mentioned, we're looking for that quantitative to qualitative shift, right? Looking at the developing forces. You look at the sort of trend of indigenous resistance and indigenous consciousness in the last 100 years, let's say, just to use that number. We've seen a huge trend in the upward direction. As a Marxist, looking at through a Marxist lens, right? We're looking at that developing trend, that developing class struggle and contradiction, right, and rising consciousness. And we should recognize that has revolutionary potential, right? And then on top of it, we should also understand, because we are looking at through a decolonial process, that we understand that there are these massive pillars of colonialism that support the foundation of the U.S. system, right? Yeah. So whether it be Christianity, which I think we really have to have an honest conversation about. When we look at most of, not even just the U.S., most of the colonial catalysts, so to speak, for the European powers were mostly through the Catholic Church or the Protestant churches, effectively. Whether it be the advent of chattel slavery in Africa, whether it be the explosion of opium trade in China, like all of these have a direct link to Christianity and the Christian church. And as somebody that grew up in the Christian church, I'm no longer Christian. I would probably describe myself as atheist. We have to understand that Christianity is very much a white supremacist foundation and overall a religious supremacist foundation that doesn't compute with a collective communal society, to be quite honest. And that's something that has been actively used against indigenous communities here, whether it be the mission system, which enslaved indigenous people here in the West Coast by Spain and Mexico, whether it be the boarding schools in Canada that were all church run, right? Like, where hundreds of children have been found in unmarked mass graves, the church is one of those massive pillars. Obviously, the economy is one too. Politics is like all these pillars are supporting this system of colonialism. When we talk about what is decolonization, what is decolonialism, it's smashing these pillars, smashing this foundation. When Marx and Lenin talk about smashing the ready state machinery, right? That is what we're talking about in this decolonial sense, right? When we're adding the decolonial with the Marxism, it is looking at these state structures, these societal structures, for class dominance, and realizing that developing forces against that are where we need to ally with, and that the end result is the smashing of those systems and the creation of something new. That is ultimately what needs.
You touched on decolonization is a metaphor. I think we call it a pamphlet, and I wanted to draw attention to this quote here from the abstract. Our goal in this article is to remind readers what is unsettling about decolonization. It says, decolonization brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor, for instance, for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Just wanted to make sure we threw that, I think, very important quote out there. But that's definitely worth a read, and it does not take too long to read. I definitely suggest folks who are not steeped in any decolonial theory to dig in. You might take issue with one or two takes, as I did. It talks about Tibet or something, but point is, I think there's a lot to be gained from that, and I'm happy you brought that up.
Also,
please.
I want to make it clear and sort of explain this. I think it's something that needs to be explained. The idea of like what is a settler, right? And a lot of us, or for example, and Dan, are settlers. Like, we have to be very honest about this reality, right? The only people that are not settlers in this country are the indigenous nations and people, and the Black community that was forced here, right? Every other community, even those that have been oppressed in other areas by imperialism, are coming on to stolen land, right? And I think we have to have a reckoning with that, and it's a very difficult conversation for settlers to have, in my opinion. It's one that decenters us automatically in the conversation in terms of struggle, and it also puts into this weird question where I think a lot of us as working class Marxists and not really think about. When we talk about, let's say, like redistribution of land, right? A lot of us Western Marxists, it's a topic of conversation that doesn't affect us because we have no land.
I don't have any land,
so to speak, right?
You got land? I don't have any land.
But in a way, we do. I think that's really something that we need to have this understanding of, that because of the historical reality and the continuation of it, where there was and still is broad mass class collaboration between settlers to oppress indigenous communities and sustain that oppression. And it's one of those things where, when I think Western Marxism, we had that conversation about redistribution of land, just to make it very specific. And we don't think about indigenous nations and their sovereignty. We think about like Jeff Bezos or like, was it BlackRock, right? We think about these like mega corporations, right? But a lot of us, and we have to also think about this too, because we're going to get into it, the MAGA right-wing Republican element of the working class that is full throt, like as collaborationists with the most fascist elements of our ruling class, right? That they do own a lot of property. They do own homes. They do own small businesses. We're literally occupying land. You know what I mean? Like, and I want to put it in the perspective of Israel and Palestine, right? Where I think a lot of Israelis are going through this process too, where they're having this like sort of crisis of faith and existential crisis, where they're like, do we belong here? And the reality is we don't. And in the same way that Israelis don't belong on stolen native Palestinian land, is the same way we settlers, even working class settlers, don't belong on this stolen land. And that will innately bring about a defensiveness amongst settler Marxists. And I want them to sort of take a step back. I want them to actually look at the history of these struggles against settler colonialism and look at what happens to settlers when they do act in solidarity with the indigenous people against that oppression. They don't get thrown out. You know what I mean? Like, they don't get their house stolen. They don't get, to use like the Haiti example, right? Where like everyone, you know, it's like the Haitian slaves killed all the white people. That's not true. There were tons of white people that helped out the Haitian slaves. A lot of them were doctors. A lot of them were sort of specialists in sort of trade. And guess what? They kept their homes. They became equal citizens of the country. You know what I mean? Like, there's a pathway for settlers to act in solidarity where it doesn't become an existential crisis. And I think it's something that we sort of, again, have to realize, like, we are going to be decentered in this process. And that's okay. And I think a lot of us want to be in the center of the process, and I understand why. It's the colonial mindset. But it's important that we do decenter ourselves. Because again, that historic and sustainment of class collaboration is just an historic fact. You know, it is wild when you really think about the history here. In the 17th century, Europeans were killing each other by the millions. I mean, who was Protestant, who was Catholic? Right? Like, that was a big fucking deal. And it was for a long time in Europe. Obviously, like, Ireland is a example of that in modern times, but that's also a colonial example. In America, those contradictions rapidly went away. Why? Because Protestant and Catholic white European settlers were more scared of indigenous resistance and African resistance. So the creation of the white identity was formed. And it has evolved and developed, obviously, like Jews and Italians in New York weren't considered white for a long time. They are now. Let's be honest, they are. But the white identity, the settler identity, was created, and it was a multi-class formation. Mm-hmm. And it has been sustained to this day. And I think that we, as settler Marxists, have to recognize that, absolutely struggle against that paradigm. And if we don't, like we've talked about earlier, it leads to that revisionism, distortion, and vulgarization of Marxism that is actually very dangerous in real life organizing spaces.
I'd like to get into now some of the differences between Marxists who are decolonial Marxists and, I suppose, non-decolonial Marxists. I don't know, vanilla Marxists? What makes them different?
It's the Tautsky and Lenin split. Like, that's really what it is, right? So, and we're gonna get into this in a bit. I know this because we talked about this last night.
Yeah, briefly.
When in regards to the Patsocs, like, are they Marxists with chauvinist tendencies? Are they chauvinists with Marxist tendencies? I think that's a very important distinction to make.
There.
In terms of, genuine Marxists and maybe are ignorant of this, right? Like, yes, they're Marxists. They're settler Marxists most likely, or they're chauvinistic Marxists. And hopefully they're in a real life organization where those ideological struggles can actually be had. Because, to be honest, when it's this online space, even what we're doing here, it's polemics to an echo chamber, largely speaking. There is a little bit of like, oh, we're going to reach new people. That happens, but it's largely reaching people that think like us in online spaces. So when we talk about in real life organizations, that's more likely to have a varying degree of personalities, opinions that actually conflict. You get contradictions and you get ideological struggles. Real ones where they actually reflect on policy and decision making. And I think, those that are ignorant of this, and if you're out there and you're not, let's say you know someone, let's say you're in DSA or PSL or whatever organization, you've been listening to Decolonize Buffalo or, whoever, you've been any more hip to decolonial thought and theory. If you have a comrade in your organization that is sort of espousing chauvinistic tendencies, start having those conversations. Because I think people that are genuinely Marxists but have ideological gaps, those people can obviously be educated, and we should. We have to be honest, though, that in online spaces, that might and most likely is not the case, though. And we have to be a little bit more wary of how much energy and time we give to people in online spaces, because it can be toxic and it can be not traumatic. That's way too harsh of a word, but it can be like mentally exhausting. Where to a point where because it doesn't lead to actual practice, it becomes even more so mentally exhausting, in my opinion. You have a real life, ideological struggle, and for example, our club went through a slight ideological struggle, so to speak, on the last 6 months. And it was slightly intense. We had to get leadership at an upper, ring of ladder, so to speak, to come in and mediate. It was that much of a conflict. I think it, as a result, made the collective better. It's the whole like iron sharpens iron, right? Like in a real life organization, that does matter. Those ideological struggles are important. Online spaces, I would say less so, to be quite honest.
Okay, seems like we have a little bit of an intro to decolonial Marxism there, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation in general. But in interest of time, and since we have some other things that we want to get to, I would want to begin talking a little bit about the Patsocs, and as we lead into that, that's great. But before we do so, do you have any great resources you would like to share with my viewers, my community, about accounts that folks could follow or other resources that they could be reading or learning about? We've already touched upon the Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and the link is there in the chat. What else would you suggest, Matthew?
I know our indigenous comrades in the chat have shouted out a bunch of other like podcasts and organizations, whether it be the International Anti-Colonial Institute, whether it be Decolonize Buffalo, the Chunka Luta Network. I think all of these organizations are fantastic. Shout out to Leaping Larry. on Twitch. You know, like I think all these indigenous comrades are doing fantastic work. You know, if you look and see what, like, for example, comrades are doing in Pine Ridge, like it's life or death over there in the winter, and they're struggling, and their ability to fundraise and organize around basic material needs is highly inspirational. So definitely just want to say salute to all of them. They've all been very inspirational to me and my ideological work, so to speak, and my in real life work too. So I really appreciate all of you. In terms of some books I want to recommend, obviously Walter Rodney, the GOAT. Where is it at? Decolonial Marxism. I know it's Verso Books. I apologize. It's Verso, but it's great. Just skip the introduction. Whenever it's a Verso book, I just always skip the introduction and forward, and it makes it better. To be quite honest, I mentioned it already, but shout out to Rick from Decolonized Buffalo, Lenin and Stalin on decolonization. It's a very short pamphlet, not pamphlet. It's more like small, very small book. It's kind of like Mao's Red Book, so just a collection of quotes from Lenin and Stalin on decolonization, decolonial theory. Highly recommend that. I've already mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. Taiki Alfred, an indigenous organizer and scholar from what is so-called Canada, as you said earlier. I like that, so-called Canada. You know, great resource. And obviously, the GOAT himself, Gerald motherfucking Horn, okay? Read Gerald Horn, okay? Like, if I can say anything for out there for comrades, read Gerald Horn. Anything that he's written, just read his work. It's not all about decolonization, I understand that, but just read everything he's written. He is our most prolific writer of our time. Out to that great man with amazing drip.
And then that takes us into the folks who maybe it's fair to say don't read those sources. They don't engage with those accounts on Twitter. And now I want to begin the conversation about the Patsocs. So Matthew, to me, the Patsocs are the guys, and they are almost always cis, straight, white guys. Almost no women, no people of color. No, it seems like almost no LGBTQIA people, and we can definitely get into that as well. And they call themselves communists. They call themselves Marxist-Leninists. And oftentimes they have imperial core aesthetics, as in they'll take like an American flag and they'll slap a hamstick on it. That's the general vibe of them. Well, first of all, do you agree? Do you disagree with that assessment?
Absolutely agree.
And so then I start thinking, like, isn't this weird? These people are in the United States in the imperial core, and you know, not every single one of them uses these American flag aesthetics, and they don't all consider themselves Patsocs. But I can't help but draw this analogy, whereby what if Nazi Germany actually won World War II? And in this hypothetical imperial Nazi German core, so-called communists started calling themselves patriotic. And then they started taking the Nazi flag and they took the swastika off and they put the hamstick on top of it. Is that too far off from sort of what these so-called Patsocs are doing?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I'm going to mention this part. I don't know if you mentioned it already on stream. The fact that you sent me this question, right? And you sent me what is the Nazbow flag, right? You just sent me the Nazbow flag. But when you talked to me last night, you said that you had made this flag. you had photoshopped the swastika out and put a hammer and sickle on it. Because you apparently had never seen the Nazbow flag. And then you accidentally recreated the Nazbow flag in this thought experiment.
I just naturally reached this in my head, yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. No, I think it's a good comparison because one, obviously Nazi Germany's imperial and fascistic plans were very much mirrored after the US and Manifest Destiny. Right. I think even when we talk about like Zionism and its imperialist and settler colonial nature, it's very much modeled after Manifest Destiny. And this idea that Americans are promised this land from sea to shining sea, and it's ours. It's just America. Indigenous people don't belong. They don't even exist in this equation. I think it is a good thought experiment. I think you're absolutely right. It would be the same. I think we have to understand two things here with the Patsocs or MAGA communists, wherever they like to be called nowadays, because I know they like to change what they're called. Both, we have to look at the ideological roots and development of how we got to these type of groups, and then the historical development of how we got these specific individuals and groups. I'll start with the first. Chauvinism, Eurocentrism. There's a great book by Robert Beale. It's called Eurocentrism and something. I know Rick Decolonized Buffalo is going to say in the chat in a second now, if he has not already. But it's a great book. I only read the first edition, which is like 100 pages. The second edition is like 200 pages. So if you haven't read it yet, read the second edition. I hear it's much better. First edition is still good. I don't want to get wrong. It's just maybe a little bit outdated in some sections. But there was a foundation set very early on for a chauvinist tendency. And again, if you want to understand what chauvinism is go back to when I said the Lenin quote about oppressor nations and oppressed nations. But Ferdinand Lassalle was definitely a chauvinist, and he's a contemporary of Marx. The entire First International was very, very eclectic. I think people don't understand that, and we tend to romanticize First International. But the First International truly was the root of a lot of issues. I mean, we get in a long way, but we do get like anarcho-capitalism and ultimately fascism from elements within the First International that were ultimately kicked out by Marx, but they were in there for some time. So we get the very foundation of like the communist and left movement in modern history has issues. It has issues with vulgarized forms, revisionists, reformists, chauvinists, whatever, maybe utopians, especially in the early days, right? And as history developed, as the movement developed, certain tendencies like utopianism were very much largely pushed out of the movement. But things like chauvinism really were not stamped out. For U.S. history, like the Socialist Party of America, think of Eugene Debs, think of the 1870s, railroad strikes and all that. They had a massive issue with racism within the Socialist Party of America. They never fought for example, integration of labor unions. They didn't fight for the black working class. It's the most common example, right? That's something that the Communist Party changed. The Communist Party USA was very much in the fight with the black working class from the very, very beginning. And it was one of the reasons why the Communist Party was created, because the Socialist Party of America did not want to get over that chauvinism. Even then, the Communist Party USA, from its pretty much entire inception, has not paid attention to indigenous struggle, the native struggle. But we get this, again, the chauvinistic element that is still allowed to permeate through the American left. Even through the Black Power movement, I forget the exact party name. It's like the Labor Party of America, I believe. A poster of them went viral like a couple days ago on left Twitter. It was the not black power, not white power, but working class power. It was that like old-timey political cartoon. And we see that sort of erasure of special contradictions throughout American left history and overall like Marxist history. So you have to understand that people like Jackson Hinkle, the infrared community with Haas, Midwestern Marxs, they're not a new aberration, so to speak, ideologically speaking. they're very much continuing a long-running trend of chauvinism, class reductionism, vulgarization of Marxism that unfortunately has just permeated the Western left. And I think I don't think we have time for this show, but there is good discussions to be had about why it seems that the Western left cannot get over this. Other areas of the world can. Even parts that were colonized and settler colonized, right? Like Cuba, for example. They've been able to deal with their colonial contradictions in their own way. Different than, let's say, South Africa or China or even USSR, but they've been dealing with it. But digressing. Now, on top of that, we have to look at how these people come into the scene, right? And I think it's important to understand that too. I am going to name names here. Like Jackson Hinkle, for example, started out as like a lib, like a Democratic Party influencer in Orange County that supported Tulsi Gabbard, who was involved in U.S. military psyops operations, supported Bernie Sanders for a period of time, and then has morphed and developed and changed. Infrared Haas is just an online streamer. The Midwestern Marxs individuals, Eddie and Noah allegedly were in the Communist Party until they have been, quote, blacklisted, as they have self-admittedly said. So these are people that, one, did not start out in any grassroots way like Jackson Hinkle. Two, did not start out in any real-life organization, still have not, like Haas. And three, like Midwestern Marxs, have been blacklisted from actual organizations, admittedly. And then you have Kayla Maupin. And this is the real linchpin here in terms of the historical connection development of all these individuals. Kayla Maupin and the the Center for Political Innovation, I believe.
CPI USA.
CPI USA, yes, I love that.
One letter off from CPI USA.
Love it. Just one letter. Just Kayla Maupin is a devout and self-admitted follower of Alexander Dugin and Lyndon LaRoche. Alexander Dugin is one of the co-founders of NASBOLS, the National Bolsheviks, which accidentally remade their flag in our thought experiment. That flag, Alexander Dugin was the one that co-made that. I know our indigenous comrades are not a big fan of this show. I understand why. Rev Left Radio does have a very good episode on Lyndon LaRoche that I do recommend in terms of it going over him, his connections to the CIA, his connections at basically being a fascist goon and cult, attacking Communist Party members, attacking other radical organizers in real life, like sending thugs to go attack organizers in real life spaces. That's the legacy of Lyndon LaRoche, who passed away in 2018, I believe, and his wife runs the Schiller Institute. The Schiller Institute has had on all of these individuals, except for maybe some of the Midwestern Marx individuals, as keynote speakers, as organizers for events, and all of these individuals have admitted at one time or another that they're all friends, that they're all inspirations for each other, and these are, like our term, like direct quotes I'm using. Like these are people that talk very often with each other, have each other on their show platform. So it's very much a informal sort of media conglomerate in terms of Hinkle, Haas, Infrared, Kayla Maupin, Midwestern Marxs, the Schiller Institute. All of these people are strenuously connected in one way or another. So that is the historical development of the Patsocs movement, these thought leaders, so to speak. It developed at the behest of a CIA independent contractor in Lyndon LaRoche and cult leader, and a legit Nazi fascist in Alexander Dugin. So that is where these people have come from, both in terms of them specifically and ideologically, stretching back over 150 years. So you have to be very wary of these people in spaces. And I understand when people, I shouldn't say understand. I hear people say, oh, well, Hinkle's, hitting millions of people about Palestine. Well, isn't it a good thing? Well, isn't that so-and-so, reaching millions of people about communism? So isn't it a good thing? If I need to reread Mao again, I will, right? If your comrade's doing something wrong, even if they're your friend, you need to call them out on that shit, right? And if you don't, you're being a liberal. Like, that is basically how Mao said it, So even if Hinkle, Haas, all these people were your friend, were my friend, they're not. If they were, I would still have a ideological duty as a communist to struggle against their chauvinism. When they're out there saying that the Nazis were all transgender and gay people, right? When they're out there saying that the MAGA movement has the revolutionary potential in the country, right? When they're out there saying that Benjamin Netanyahu isn't that bad of a guy because he's friends with Putin, okay? These are all people that are dangerous to these spaces, that have severe ideological gaps, and that's to say in the nicest way possible. Because when you look at the historical connections of these people, I don't think, to use terms we mentioned earlier, I don't think they're Marxists with chauvinist tendencies. I think they're chauvinists with Marxist tendencies, meaning that they have co-opted Marxism, they have co-opted this verbiage to appeal to a disenfranchised, upset working class base, right? And try to lead it astray from actual organizing towards a revolution. And all of that entails, right? Because the reality is that there's no way impossible. If you are a Marxist and you're using a Marxist methodology, you think the most reactionary, terroristic, and chauvinistic action of the working class, petty bourgeois class, and bourgeois classes, which are represented by MAGA, have the revolutionary potential, right? And this is where we get a vulgarization, because in the debate, and I know we're going to get into the debate, I know we have some clips if you want to play, but when Noah talks about this revolutionary potential that MAGA has, it's ignoring all of those issues. It's ignoring foundations of Marxism, actually twisting the foundation, because he's saying that because MAGA is so upset, because MAGA is such a galvanized base, it's the most developing force in the country. And he used dialectics in a backwards reactionary way of saying, well, that's the most developing force in our country. And that's not Marxism, because that base does not change the status quo. It reinforces the colonial structure. It reinforces the imperialist structure. It's not a developing force antagonistic to capitalism. It's a developing force antagonistic at best to neoliberal capitalism and wanting to replace it with just fascism. So it's very, I have a hard time understanding how people get sucked into the Hinkle and the Haas and the Caleb Maupins of the world, because to me they're so grossly wrong and misusing Marxism. Midwestern Marx, though, and we talked about this last night a little bit, Midwestern Marx, it's on the fence, and for all intents and purposes, they seem to be a gateway to that type of content. If you're a Marxist out there, if you're a communist out there, and you're really online a lot, you're seeing like Eddie's TikTok videos or whatever, right? That becomes a thing that you watch. and then all of a sudden you get Jackson Hinkle on your stream. They're not going to question him on this stuff because they're buddies with them. They call him an inspiration. That's a direct quote, an inspiration. So I think we just have to be very cautious of these people, because I even if we want to be nice Midwestern Marxs, so to speak, and say, oh, they've done a lot of reading, they seem to at least know some Marxism. That may be true. But if that is true, that makes their mistakes even more egregious. Like, I know I have ideological gaps, right? And I always have to sort of, I can guess whether or not I come on shows like these, because like I don't want to come on these shows and not provide something educational or truly really use a Marxist methodology, right? I don't want to misuse it. And we have these people that are constantly going on these shows and don't care about misusing it. And even self-admittingly say, like, we're using a very vulgarized, or what should I say, a very basic form of Marxism to reach a broader mass of the online. Again, that's where we get distortion. I mean, I don't want to besmirch these individuals, because I think they've done good work too, but like even people like Richard Wolff or David Harvey, like academics, right? Academic Marxists that have put in a lot of work in the Western Marxist academic, right? They have gaps in their ideology. They have gaps in their theory. And you've seen, like, let's say, for example, like David Harvey in his late stage of his life tried to grapple with those gaps, especially in regards to China. And I salute him for that. It's still gaps that have led to distortions throughout the Western left. But even the people that I find to be genuine Marxists, like Richard Wolff or David Harvey, I still critique them on their shit, right? And I see Midwestern Marxs, I see these Patsocs really, again, distorting Marxism and being, again, outright fascist. Like, for the Hinkles and Haas of the world, they are fascists that are co-opting Marxism. Maybe Midwestern Marx is genuinely misunderstanding it. Maybe a person like Eddie, who's younger, is being led astray by a guy like Carlos, who's a PhD undergrad or whatever, some bullshit, and Noah, who is like a 40-year-old meth head. I don't know. These are all things I don't know. But the reality is that they're distorting and vulgarizing Marxism, that they are social chauvinists, and they should be combated on every level, because to not do that would to be a liberal. I'm not a liberal.
So for those who are brand new to the discussion about and you're calling them Patsocs, I call them Patsocs. I've never known. It's one of those words, It's just, I guess you make it up. If you come across the Wikipedia article, folks, you might notice that it says a Marxist-Leninist who supports chauvinist positions. And it seems like we're starting to talk about those. We've been talking about those. You've been touching on those a lot. For instance, ignoring the special or main contradictions. I'm noticing there's sexism, there's some racism. I'm noticing homophobic behavior and anti-LGBTQIA behavior. It's really quite interesting that they are more upset with folks like you for alleged purity testing than they are at their own audience for being racists, sexists, and homophobes, and just generally anti-LGBTQIA. They also have this thing where they don't consider baristas to be working class. The fuck is that all about? So therefore, they're not really on board with the unionization of Starbucks's.
They don't really think service workers are working class.
Oh my God. How are you? Okay. So obviously I don't want to spend a ton of time on that, but I want to get to next, now that we sort of understand that kind of chauvinism, I'm not really sure if I have a functional definition of chauvinism in my head, to be honest, and that's something I need to do some work on. But does revolutionary defeatism also fit into that conversation about how they are or not chauvinist? Is that a different question? As Lenin says in Defeat of One's Own Government in the Imperialist War, and actually before I read this quote, is it fair that, Matthew, throughout our entire lives, the United States has been involved in imperialist wars? Like nonstop?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, either imperial or colonial wars, yes.
So here's a quote. A little Lenin quote to thread in here. He says, during a reactionary war, a revolutionary class cannot but desire the defeat of its government, its own government. The reason why the chauvinists repudiate the defeat slogan is that this slogan alone implies a consistent call for revolutionary action against one's own government in wartime. Without such action, millions of ultra-revolutionary phrases, such as a war against the war and the conditions, etc., are not worth a brass farthing. The opponents of the defeat slogan are simply afraid of themselves when they refuse to recognize the very obvious fact of the inseparable link between revolutionary agitation against the government and helping bring about its defeat. How is that quote relevant to the Patsocs that we're talking about, and we are going to start drilling in more into specifically the Midwestern Marxists?
I think that the social chauvinists within Marxist spaces have definitely adapted, to be quite honest, especially within the U.S. left, right? And I would say, largely speaking, it's been a lesson learned by revisionists. I don't mean this in like a nice way, like, oh, they learned their lesson. I mean, like, they learn how to be better at being revisionists. Because you really don't get like the Katowski and Bernstein-esque left anymore. You do get a little bit of that, like you did get some of the left that supports like our involvement in Ukraine. But I would say that is a very small section of the left. And when we're talking about the communist movements in particular, that's a much smaller percentage, if at all. Like, I don't know any communist organization that has like a pro-U.S. involvement in Ukraine stance, right? For example, I do know there are communists that have pro-Ukraine stances. You do still get some of like the Bernstein-esque types that support their imperialism internationally. But I would say that Patsocs and the MAGA communists, that they developed a new way of being revisionist, where they have used anti-imperialism as a way to legitimize themselves. Whether it be taking correct stances on China or Taiwan, for more specific example, or Ukraine, Russia, or Palestine, taking a correct anti-imperialist stance there, they have figured out, gives them legitimacy. And they can launder all the homophobic, reactionary bullshit that they peddle in, right? Hinkle has been going on for 100 and so days supporting Palestine. A week before that, he was supporting Netanyahu.
You know who else has a good working relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu? Vladimir Putin has a very good working relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm actually happier that, for the sake of, the multipolar world order, that he is in power right now compared to the previous coalition in Israel. Xi Jinping of the Communist Party of China has a good working relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, better than the previous coalition.
But digressing there, he's been supporting Palestine, right? Then he goes on Sneako's podcast or live stream, right? And Sneako's a big Twitch streamer or something. I don't really know. I'm not hip like the kids those stay anymore, I guess. But anyways, big time streamer, I guess. Hinkle goes on and says all Nazis are transgenders and gays. Like, in the middle of him being like, we need to support Palestine. So we see in real time, very recently, this policy, so to speak, that they have, where they take a staunch anti-imperialist stance. They seem legitimate. But then they can be as reactionary as they want, because if you come at them, you're coming at an ally that's standing with Palestinians, right? Or standing for peace in Ukraine or some bullshit, right? Like, or standing with China. Why are you going to come at him? He's standing with China. He's standing with Palestinians. Like, that is how they have figured out to give themselves legitimate cover amongst the left. I think that's something that we have to sort of not ignore, but it's something that we really can't let it be used as a real defense for them, right? That, and this is something that Noah did in the debate, that, oh, look at what Hinkle is doing with Palestine and how many people he's reaching. But if your fans are going out there and calling everyone the F slur and the R slur and talking about, phrenology, basically, and soul sizes and shapes, and, do I really want you defending Palestinians? Not really. I really don't want you in this space. If you're not going to defend our trans comrades, our gay comrades in this space, I don't want you. Like, you're dangerous, and to me, you're taking a stance that's far more in line with Israel, which is trying to use oppression on gay people to flip them into informants on Palestinians. Like, to me, like, you're no better than Israel, right? And overall, Patsocs are no better than Zionists. They're not. Like, I think we need to start calling them Zionists, like American Zionists, labor Zionists, whatever you want to call them, right? And for those that are like, oh, Zionists are all like Benjamin Netanyahu, read about Zionism. Please, hold on. Where's the book? Here it is. Everyone, you can find it for free online on PDF on like archive.org or whatever, right? But Original Sins by Benjamin Bet Alami. He's a professor. He's still alive at Haifa University in occupied Palestine. And he goes in depth on the left Zionist tendency, which was the mainstream Zionist tendency for most of its existence. Most of Zionist existence has been socialist, secular, and leftist. It's a very recent phenomenon where we get the far right Likud party, we get this overt fascism. For decades, Zionists wanted to play themselves as socialists, leftists, forward-thinking, all this stuff, And that's what we see here with Hinkle, Haas, and all these people, that they're trying to portray themselves and portray this fascist colonial institution, which is the United States, as a progressive force in history. The U.S. is fundamentally not a progressive force in history. Its creation was a reactionary response, indigenous and African resistance. Its continuation and sustainment has been a reaction to indigenous and African resistance throughout the entire world. So I'm sorry, I don't see how like these Patsocs can really get up here and like portray America as progressive, portray settlers as progressive, and this has to be combated. Like, these people need to be forcibly pushed out of organizing spaces for good. And I hope that every leftist podcaster, leftist streamer, if you invite these people on, they're not invited on for a comradely chat. They're invited on to ruthlessly struggle against ideologically speaking. Otherwise, you're being a liberal. That's the reality.
We've touched on, generally speaking, the Patsocs, and we've been touching on some of the specific Patsocs. We left out a few. I think maybe we might consider Peter Coffin to be a Patsoc, Samira Khan as well. These people have F slur and R slur mouth diarrhea. I did notice Danny Haifong had Xiang Yu on. I'm not sure if I'm saying their name. Yeah. Hassan Ali as well, I think, has some of this chauvinist tendency as well.
There is a huge issue with Chinese media inviting on LaRocheites, followers of Lyndon LaRoche, the Schiller Institute. It seems to be a big issue. One thing I can say for it is that there's probably a multifactored reason for that. One of them being they might not be aware of the internal relations, so to speak, in the struggle that these people have, right? For example, like a Chinese media producer, right? That's like trying to get a show together for a Monday night, right? They might not be aware like Jackson Hinkle is not liked in organizing spaces here in the U.S. They just see that he has 2 million followers on Twitter and he's talking about Palestine, right? The Schiller Institute also is a massively bankrolled institution. They have some slush fund. Their ability to pay for people to get media appearances is absolutely a possibility. And I think some of those contributing factors are why we see these people get TV sort of shine. There's a reason why like Jackson Hinkle is getting on Fox News all the time. It's not because he's a communist, guys. I swear to you, that's not why.
To help illustrate this, here's one of your tweets, and we'll pull up this video later. You talking with Noah, but here's someone replying to it, saying, "This is how the average leftist who whines about Patsocs and MAGA communists look like." And I was curious about the post engagements, and Zhang Yu is one of the people who thought that was a very funny tweet. So, folks, that's sort of an illustration of what we're up against. And with that, before we get into more specifically talking about Midwestern Marxs and your debate, do you consider Patsocs to be comrades? Why or why not?
No, I do not think they're comrades. And I sort of said this earlier, but I'll sort of reiterate it.
Yeah.
The comrades that we know in real life have ideological gaps or ignorant about certain things, but are genuinely in the struggle. They can be educated. I think the Patsoc movement is a mostly online movement of disaffected white young men, mostly incels, who are deeply reactionary, who have when they talk about class unity, they want every oppressed community to be in solidarity with the white working class. That's what it's not the reversal. It's not that white workers need to be in solidarity with the oppressed communities. It's the reverse. And to me, I don't find that in any way comradely at all. And these are people that have made threats against me, at least their fans have, I should say, not them in particular, but their fans have definitely made personal threats against me. No, I wouldn't view any of these people as comrades. I would view them as dangerous provocateurs. That if you see them in real life, let them not be comfortable. Don't let them be comfortable in your organizing space, I'll say.
All right, Matthew, let's go ahead and segue next into the Midwestern Marxs Project. More specifically, we've been speaking broadly about Patsocs, and I want to get a little bit more into this. For those who don't know what Midwestern Marxs is, tell us a little bit about the project.
It's a self-described educational institute. A YouTube channel. They have a YouTube channel. They have a TikTok. I think the TikTok is really big from what I hear. The three main people are a man by the name of Eddie Smith, who's a collegiate wrestler, it looks like. And then we have a guy by the name of Carlos. He's a PhD candidate or undergrad in philosophy or something. And then Noah, allegedly that's his name. And
he lies. He be lying.
I'll say that what I know personally, right, is that Eddie was in the Communist Party USA. He went to a couple meetings and then kind of went MIA, from what I have been told by comrades that were there locally he was at. Noah, he still claims to be in the Communist Party. Eddie, for example, took it off his description on the staff page on the Midwestern Marxs website. And Noah still claims to be in the Communist Party. I have not heard anyone say that they have heard of him or know him. I don't know. None of them have ever written for the party, whether it be People's World or International Department, Red World Review. And for example, I've written for both of them. You can find my articles on both party outlets. Since they're internet content creators, we think that they would have created some sort of content for our YouTube pages. They have not. And for example, AT from Second Thought, a much bigger YouTube channel, if I can say, much bigger, has made content for our party for each of our international conferences. If you go to our CPUSA's International Department YouTube page and look at our international conferences, you can see JT from Second Thought there. Now, it's not like we're not allowing internet streamers or content creators that are in the party to create content in the party. I do find it very odd that these two alleged party members and avid content creators have just never made content for the party ever in their lives.
Curious.
And I've said this already, they sit on the fence of the Patsocs MAGA communist movement. And I would say that they have slowly, but very quickly now, rapidly shifted more towards getting off that fence and being on the side of the Patsocs completely.
Whereas, if I can just real quickly interject, whereas someone like Jordan Hinkle is way off the deep end of that spectrum.
Jackson Hinkle, but I like how you combine Jordan Peterson and Jackson Hinkle's names. You said Jordan Hinkle.
I don't even know what I said.
Jordan Hinkle. It's okay. It's okay. Jackson Hinkle took a picture of Jordan Peterson and said they're going to take down the globalists together. So, hey, not too far off there.
There it is. Sorry.
But you're right. Yes, Jackson Hinkle is far clearly a MAGA communist provocateur. He is self-described MAGA communist. While the Midwestern Marxs would say, no, they're just friends with us. We're not MAGA communists. We're friends with Jackson Hinkle. We've worked with him. He's an inspiration. So it's one of the things where like they don't outright say that they are this, but they say everything around it to admit that they are MAGA communists and Patsocs.
De facto.
And they've been around for some time, and I would say in the beginning they did not exude as much of this tendency, though that could be because they weren't on my radar as much and because I wasn't as aware of decolonial theory at the time. I will kind of chalk that up. So maybe, it's a little bit of romanticism, so to speak, on them starting up. Because I was never a big fan of their content. I never really watched their content, I'll say that. But they have had on legitimate people, a la like Vijay Prashad. I know some of our indigenous comrades have had issues with them as of late. And I understand those issues. But historically, I've very much liked Vijay Prashad. I've liked his work. I think Red Star Over the Third World is a fantastic book to read on the USSR's attempts at decolonization, especially in regards to Central Asia. I think that's a very fascinating book. And it's, again, very odd for Prashad to come out against decolonial theory the way he has, in a very semantic way as well.
Yeah, but I saw that tweet. What a wild tweet. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah,
it just doesn't make sense to me. But
it didn't track.
Midwestern Marxs has had this air of legitimacy because they have claimed a connection to the Communist Party.
Yeah,
and they have had a very rapid rise online, and therefore that has given them access to certain people, right? And you have a few 100,000 followers on TikTok or 50,000 subscribers on YouTube. It's easy to get a guy like Vijay Prashad on for an interview. I guarantee a guy like Vijay Prashad, or let's say other more legitimate people that have been interviewed by Midwestern Marxs, they aren't aware of these tendencies that they have, these chauvinist tendencies. They're not reading all their content because I'm not reading all their content. Like they've posted tons of articles. I'm not reading all their fucking articles. I'm not. Okay, I've read a few. They're bad. For those that kind of want to gauge on why it's bad, first read Gerald Horne's On a Revolution in 1776. and then read Midwestern Marx's article debunking it, which I think is a fascinating juxtaposition there. But anyways, again, they have tried to become more legitimate in ways that like Hinkle and Haas haven't. And a person like Caleb Maupin just can't because of his reputation as a sexual predator nowadays, to be quite honest.
Oh man,
Midwestern Marx is the legitimate. We're the real Marxists. We're the educators here. We're the academics here, and I think a lot of people get kind of sucked into that. And this is a thing I will say overall, right? I don't think, for lack of a better term, our enemies here, right, are dumb. I think that's a real bad stance to have, to underestimate our opponents.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are well read. They are. Now, obviously, they're vulgarizing it to a significant degree. But I don't think these guys are lying about how much they've read Marx, Lenin, etc., right?
I think I agree.
And that is why I think they have been successful in appearing to be legitimate.
That's
because if you're coming into these spaces,
what makes them dangerous.
Exactly. If you come into these spaces not having read a lot, it's very easy to watch a few of these videos and you hear the jargon being used, like they're smart, got it, you know. And it's something that I've seen on a very small level, right? At our club level, I've seen certain comrades come in, they join the party, but they really haven't read like Marx or Lenin. Like they're a leftist. You know what I mean? They're kind of ideologically eclectic, so to speak. They hear the Communist Party, they think that's radical, so they join. And it's a process to get them ideologically educated. And it's a process that is best done when it's one, collective, two, always reinforced by in real life practice, and three, has real life connections to historical struggles. Meaning, like, I can go and talk to a comrade that was there in the 1960s that struggled or whatever it may be against the Vietnam War, whatever struggle, right? I have those living connections. That's really important, right? It's important for us to talk about the theory, talk about the ideology, but then to go into the world and then to do something based on that ideology, and then come back and go, well, did it work? If it didn't work, why didn't it work? You know what I mean? Like, that is really the nuts and bolts of like the revolution, is that process. Is having the ideology, having the revolutionary theory, but then you have to go into the world, you know, have a plan of work, do some work, and if it fucks up, you try to assess and analyze, why did it mess up? What tactics were misused? Was my strategy off base? That stuff, far more important than watching, no offense, Dan, watching streamers or watching, you know, like YouTube educational content. That only gets you so far.
Yeah.
It has to be this dialectical connection between the real world and what's inside your head. If it's only going on inside your head, it's nothing. It's useless. It's a dead plant. No, it's not living.
Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
And the Midwestern Marx group, they're not intent on changing it. They're only intent on educating people for Patreon money, for YouTube ad money, whatever it may be. It has no connection to a real material work being done. And that's also, again, the alarming part here, is that I hope people out there, if they're listening, they're like, hey, I kind of like some of Eddie's TikTok videos. Like, hey, like whatever you want online, so to speak, but go into an actual organizing space. Like, go do that, because all this online stuff, it doesn't matter. Like, yes, it does a little bit. Sorry, it does matter a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, it is nothing unless you go out into the world. And those organizing spaces, those debates, struggles, ideologically speaking, that are being done there at this moment are far more important than YouTube debates. You know, like when we're having that ideological debate within our club, within our party of like, you know, it's an election year. It's a rise of labor union struggles within the city. It's a rise of a housing crisis issue. Where do we struggle? Where do we struggle at the moment, in the immediate, in the long term? These questions are very, very important. And if you're only online, you lose out on this. And I just see it, you know, and I hope to God that comrades out there that are online lie and they recognize that and take the step back, get offline, and go meet some people, because I guarantee it's going to be better. I guarantee it's going to be more fulfilling for you as a communist in these online interactions.
I definitely like to remind my audience and my community that this is the jumping off point. You know, this isn't the work. This isn't it. I mean, this is sort of part of my role in the so-called revolution. I do myself inhabit an educational role, but this isn't it. The point is to educate you so that you go out and you organize.
It's also different, I would say, what you're doing and what Midwestern Marxs is doing, for example.
I hope so.
I don't think you get on here and ever go like, I'm the expert. Like, let me teach all of you like unwashed masses about Marxism with like a monocle in your eye. No, it's always a co-learning process on your streams. You are learning as you're learning with the people listening. That's drastically different than a group of people calling themselves educators and trying to, again, lead classes, like actual classes, Marxism. I think that's dangerous.
Let's segue into your debate with one of the Midwestern Marxs guys. His name is Noah Kratchvik. That's how he goes online. There's some different theories as to what his name is in the chat. And let's start with this first link here, this first video, this clip you got. You say Midwestern Marxs is a MAGA communist outlet. I think they might take issue with that, but I do think that that's not inaccurate. You say there's no way you can use Marxist methodology to think MAGA is part of the revolutionary momentum right now. Is that what they say? They say part of the revolutionary momentum? That's a direct quote?
Yes.
And so you say stop vulgarizing Marxism. Stop being chauvinists. It's not that hard, Eddie. So here we go with Noah and from the top. And let me know if you have any audio issues here.
And I think that's a problem. I also think that in a lot of these spaces, people tend to overlook the significance and importance of the internet. There's a reason I can go to work and people know Jackson Hinkle's name, because he's much better than I am or you are at using that internet to get just the word communism out there. There's something there. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying this is a very early stage in revolutionary momentum. Everything's going to be unperfect in this stage, but you go forward from there. And so trying to minimize one thing because you're doing something else is just silly, man. There's no need for it.
I'm glad you also just clarified that you think the MAGA movement is where the revolutionary momentum's coming from. Thank you.
It's not just them. It's
not just them.
So he does agree.
For us, dude, you can't, as soon as I start talking, you go in. It's not just them, but they're a part of it. The Bernie movement was a part of it. The Trump movement is part of it. It's all these
they're this
people just starting to figure out that there's a problem. Do they have the solution yet? No, of course not. Right?
Oh my God. He sort of he almost equated the revolutionary potential of the Bernie Sanders movement to MAGA.
He did.
Didn't
I mean,
he?
I think that is an equation of them, to be quite honest.
I feel like that's not unfair to say that that was part of his point.
And I mean, where to even begin here? Because I feel like it's such a like he admitted it. Like I don't like what do I need to say? Like he admits that he thinks the MAGA movement and the Bernie movement are equal parts of this revolutionary momentum rising in the country, and that's such a misunderstanding of what's happening, right? There's a national crisis, right? And Lenin talks about this. Stalin talks about this. So again, people that have said they've read Lenin and Stalin a lot, like I know you have because you quote him enough, Noah and Midwestern Marx people. But clearly you guys are misusing it because I've read a lot of Lenin and Stalin too. And when they talk about like a national crisis happening, right? At the working class, especially at that time, the peasant class too, they become radicalized, but not in one direction. It's not that all of them become radicalized towards socialism, right? There's an element of radicalization towards the right. There's an element of radicalization towards reactionary politics policies. That's why you had the development of, at the same time as the 1905 revolution, the same development, the same time as when the Soviets were first created, have the Black Hundreds take off, commit mass pogroms against Jews and Slavs, and other ethnic minorities and national minorities too. Like there's a reason why you have this radicalization, and that's the word I want to use. Because radicalization could go both ways. It's not only meaning left-wing radicals. It's not that MAGA and Bernie represent a rise in revolutionary potential. They represent antithetical potentials. One is a revolutionary potential, and one is a counter-revolutionary potential to enhance the status quo. And that is an important distinction to make, that Midwestern Marx wants to flatten those distinctions, wants to make it seem like it's all one big thing. It's all one in totality. And that's maybe a huge misuse of the word collective as well by them. I don't know. But it's, again, clearly an issue. I want to make a brief point from the comment. Shout out to Derek Plants Fanon, who responded to me saying this is the Patsocs are like an online issue. That's a miss spoke by me, because I do know, and indigenous comments have told me that they have been harassed, abused in real life by Patsocs, settler Marxists, etc. And I don't want to dismiss that level of abuse that my indigenous comrades, our indigenous comrades have experienced. I think it's important that we understand that there is still settler chauvinism permeated throughout organizing spaces, right? That needs to be combated completely. Because that can lead to abuse, that can lead to a lot of different issues. Not just oppression towards indigenous people, but also, like you mentioned, sexism, homophobia. These issues can become more in vogue in organizing spaces if chauvinism is not directly dealt with in its entirety. So I did slightly misspeak there, and I want to apologize. This is also a real life phenomenon as well. It's not purely an online one. I will say, and maybe comrades if in the chat if I'm wrong, it seems to be spearheaded as an online movement that's manifesting itself in real life spaces. Again, comrades, correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. I just wanted to make note of that. I don't want to minimize anyone's abuse that they have faced in real life.
What did you want to accomplish with this debate? Do you feel like you accomplished it?
I kind of went in knowing it was going to be a hostile debate.
It was a shit show.
I don't know if you got to the point where I'm just like constantly getting muted by Noah.
That's wild. He threatened to mute you right off the bat because you sort of jumped in, and then he just started doing the same exact thing. So why don't you get the mute button too?
You know, I knew going on to their territory, you know, I was was not going to have the power in the situation, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I was okay with that. I knew if we would do it on like my channel, it was going to reach a much smaller audience. I wanted a public dragging that I was going to do against Midwestern Marxs be as widely seen as possible. Because I knew I wasn't going to go in and like convince Noah or these people that, hey, you know, you're chauvinist, you're wrong. Because like I said at the top of our show here, that, you know, that settlers naturally get very defensive when called out. Especially settler Marxists. We think we're right. We're Marxists, so we think we're right. So when we're called out for being wrong about something, it's an issue. And it's an issue for us. And something that we have to get over. I knew I wasn't going to convince them through polemics. We did agree, and it's unfortunate that Noah lied about this. He did agree to give me the opening 5 minutes to make my points in full. And I think that would have led to a more educational conversation between Noah. But that's clearly not what they wanted, which is fine. I wanted to publicly drag them. I wanted to expose them for being Patsocs and MAGA communists. I wanted to show that they're at them sitting on the fence, and the things that they are saying does show that they are MAGA communists, just like Jackson Hinkle. They're just trying to take a little bit different tact about it. But that was my goal. I wanted to drag and expose them. I hope I accomplished that.
I think you held your own, and I'm sort of surprised it was. I just realized it was only on his platform. I sort of thought you did like a back and forth thing, but no, you went into the lion's den. You stood on your own 2 feet, and I thought that you made Noah look obtuse. And it started making me think whether or not he was being deliberately obtuse. And it just started getting, weird because, you just sort of can't trust anyone these days. But I thought you did, from the 30 minutes that I watched, I thought you did a good job. What would you say was one of the main arguments that you had? It felt like one of the main arguments he was making was that settler colonialism in the United States, and so-called United States, is over because something the frontier has already been explored and colonized. And that sort of made me think, well, like if I'm in so-called Israel and I'm renting a house from Yaqub, that's not settler colonialism because Yaqub already stole the house from the Palestinians. That sort of feels like how his argument would boil down if applied to Israel. Is that accurate? What do you think, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I brought up the Israel comparison, which they at Midwestern Marxs admit is settler colonialism. It's absolutely a case of Palestinian self-determination, right? Like, they're very accurate on that. Like, I've been saying, like, the Patsocs take a good anti-imperialist stance usually to hide their illegitimacy. But when that same analysis is now used for our internal colony, right? The native nations, which there's 560 plus, I think, in North America, that they don't deserve self-determination because it's all been developed into something new. It's a new thing. It's no longer colonialism. It's now purely finance capital. And when I brought up, well, Israel is, like you guys admit, settler colonialism, but it's clearly financed by finance capital and imperialism. So the idea that settler colonialism cannot coexist with finance capital, the monopoly stage of finance capital, I should say more specifically, that is not true when we look at other cases in contemporary history. So yeah, I mean, I think their overall point was that colonialism as a process, if they would even say it's a process, has ended. That it ended around 100 years ago, give or take. Years change depending who you ask. And that because most indigenous people don't live on reservations, which I don't know if that's even true. That's what they claimed. And therefore, that they've been made into proletariats, just like the rest of us. And just an erasure of their indigeneity. And that's huge issue. I don't understand why they, like you said, like it becomes to a point where is it deliberate? Are you deliberately this obtuse? Because if you've read this much Marx, Lenin, Stalin, etc., shouldn't be falling into this ideological gap.
It's not Marx. It's not scientific. Elements of the old are brought into the new forms. I don't understand it. How are you just going to just arbitrarily say, "Oh, it's over, it's ended"?
Like I said, the Robert Beale a book, Eurocentrism in the Marxist movement, I believe it's what it's called. Again, I know Rick has said it in the chat a few times. I apologize, Rick. I haven't seen it. That talks about how, like, because Marx and Engels were primarily writing from a Western European perspective, right? That if you are dogmatically looking at Marxism only through that lens, you will misuse the Marxist methodology in regards to the so-called U.S. Paradigm, Africa, Latin America, etc. Right? And Walter Rodney in Decolonial Marxism talks about this as well, though not as in depth and as much of a focal point as Robert Beale, but also does talk about it. That even Lenin in his day was able to understand that the Marxist methodology, when moved to different material conditions and different time, has to shift, not change, has to shift. And obviously, like, one of Lenin's big breakthroughs was it wasn't just the dictatorship of the proletariat. Like, that in of itself is a dogmatic way of looking at Marxism. It's the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. That was what Lenin developed for the Russian experience, or the Soviet experience, I should say. And I think we also have to understand that when we talk about what our dictatorship looks like, so to speak, post-revolution, we have to center the indigenous nations as a determining factor, determining voice, because it is their stolen land. And we talk about sovereignty and self-determination over all of the land. And we have to understand that they are going to be centered in the dictatorship and not the settler proletariat class, or working class, I should say, more specifically. And I think that's a really odd thing for a lot of Marxists to grapple with. Not odd, but it's a hard thing, because we are so ingrained with working class power, dictatorship of the working class, dictatorship of the proletariat. Like, that is, in a sense, force-fed to us over and over and over again. That is dogmatic. Another good example is Yemen. The People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the only socialist Arabic country, or I say Marxist communist Arabic country, because, like, Egypt was quasi-socialist, other countries were quasi-socialist, but PDR Yemen was a legit Marxist-Leninist controlled country, right? I recommend every Marxist here in the West goes and read their constitution. Not that long, but they talk about, I think it's the opening page, that they expanded the dictatorship drastically. They included the intelligentsia, they included elements of the petty bourgeois class, like, they included, like, this wide range of people in this dictatorship, and it's said in the Constitution. So, to understand the Marxist methodology, you have to understand that our version of a revolution has to be decolonial, has to be centering indigenous voices and nations, and Midwestern Marxs just does not do that at all. They refuse to do that completely, unfortunately.
I think we're touching on specifically Midwestern Marx and their version of Patsocism. They're ignoring these certain special or main contradictions in the so-called United States. How else does the Midwestern Marxist have hypocritical and or opportunist views on native self-determination? How do we mean opportunist, Matthew?
Well, it's opportunist in the way that obviously, like I've said, that they will support the Palestinian native struggle for money. That's what it is. They're looking for views. Palestine is the hot thing in the news right now, so they're going to cover it a lot and cover it from a pro-Palestinian angle, of course. When it becomes native struggle here, native resistance in the U.S., they don't cover it. You know what I mean? Like, it's not money for them. Like, that's the reality. So that's how it's like, in terms of like real dollars and cents, how it's opportunists, how they're being grifters. They're not being principled Marxists. They're using Marxists when it leads to them getting greater internet attention.
So we would mean opportunist in the way in which they benefit from it personally. They found an opportunity, not by, they didn't find an opportunity to stand, to be a consistent Marxist, to be a consistent decolonial activist or whatever. They found a way to pounce on the situation in a way that benefits themselves.
And I encourage people, if you want to, if people out there want to actually understand like why I am so hard on Midwestern Marxs, look at who's watching their content. Look at who's replying to their content. Look at the things they're saying. It's no different than going to like a Nazi like 4chan like forum. Like, it really isn't from back in the day. Like, when I remember like going on 4chan, and like the horrors of like 2007, 2008, like, it's no different. It's the same internet culture. And that type of internet Nazi fascist culture is at no point ever dismissed by the people that are creating that content. They're never going out and saying, "Oh, we don't support that. Please don't say that. We support the gay community. We support the LGBTQ plus community. Support our trans comrades." All of you listeners out there, or watchers out there, saying this stuff, please stop. Like, that is such an easy thing to do. Is to try to, in a sense, police the audience and fan base you're creating. As content creators, you should be very aware of what fans you're creating, what type of audience that you're cultivating, right? We've seen this discussion across like the bread tube sphere, right? About like, what's your audience? What are they saying? That's reflective of you as a content creator. And I think that's another huge indictment on them. Look at who they're associating with. Axon Hinkle, Haas, Infrared. Look at who they're associating with. The Jordan Petersons of the world. Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay? Lyndon fucking LaRoche. Okay? And look at the fans they're cultivating. The audience they're cultivating, which is deeply reactionary. That's a problem. That is a direct result of the type of content they are making. It's not an accident that all the people that hate gay people, hate trans people, are out there listening to Midwestern Marxs. It's not a coincidence. There's a direct correlation between the two. Again, comrades out there, if you are supporting this stuff, stop, because you're falling into a classic like fascist pipeline. Like, this is the left wing psyop version of like what Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin used to do. Like, it's the same thing. Like, I wouldn't be surprised. Pure tinfoil hat moment. Yeah. I know. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a boardroom where like there was one chalkboard on one side and another chalkboard on the other side, and like Ben Shapiro and the IDW are on this side, and then like the MAGA communists are on this side. And it's just the FBI going like, how can we fuck with them today? Like, honestly, like, yeah. They're
Tucker Carlson's office.
Same coin.
Let's pull up another clip so we can dig in a little bit more into your debate with Noah. In this clip, you say the entire outlet upholds settler colonialism in the United States and explicitly has a hypocritical and opportunist view on native self-determination. Maybe this will help to drive that point home we were just making here.
How do I vulgarize Marxism?
Well, again, you want to ignore certain special contradictions that exist in our capitalist
society. Where does
to appeal to a class unity, and again, class reductionism, which goes back to my point.
You know, everyone that I've ever heard say class reductionism doesn't understand what class analysis is.
I don't even understand why he's saying that. Everyone who makes that point isn't in the room with you right now, talking directly with you. Why is that even important? Shut the fuck up.
No, there are different forms of class struggle, my man.
I understand that, Noah.
They're never going to be perfect. This is what
like the anti-colonial struggle against settler colonialism.
Sure, like Palestine is going through right now.
And native nations here will one day go through.
I'm not going to tell them to do that.
I'm not telling them. That's just the natural course of history when it comes to settler colonialism. You need an anti-colonial national liberation movement, right?
I don't see
those things happen.
He goes, I don't see it. Ay.
The best part is that he himself brought up Palestine. Like,
yeah,
he put himself in that like ideological trap. And it's sad. It's very sad.
What else do we need to know about your debate with Sir Noah? Because this is just...
I would say if you're out there and you haven't seen it yet, you don't need to watch it. Those two clips are indicative of the entire thing. Yeah. You know, check out what Indigenous comrades are saying. If you're in an area where there is an Indigenous community, where there is native sovereign land, it's important to start organizing with your Indigenous comrades. And it's important to understand too that Indigenous sovereignty as it exists today is a contradiction. That the U.S. gives Native nations sovereignty at the same time explicitly stating in federal law that they are the guardian of Indigenous nations, and Indigenous nations are the wards.
Yeah.
So we have to understand here that Indigenous communities have to move a certain way too, in terms of legal purposes. Like the Indigenous government of, let's say, like the Comanche. If they were to come out and say, like, we reject the guardian and ward relationship, right? We wanted to claim full sovereignty. Right? The U.S. government can come down and repress them completely. So we have to understand a little bit of how, like, we have to move in spaces and be conscious of that. But get on it. You know, if it's just something that we have been dropping the ball on 200 years as the left in this country, the settler left. We have not decentered ourselves or organizing in solidarity with Indigenous comrades. I think we start doing that, we're going to see a drastic shift in the class struggle. Like I said, if you're a settler comrade in certain areas where there is close proximity, Indigenous communities are organized, are finding a way to do it. There's going to be organizations there locally that are mutual aid organizations. Email them, ask how you can help. Like, it's very easy to ask how you can help. That's all you have to do. No one's asking you to go be a leader, to go lead a cadre within Indigenous communities. We're not asking you to do that. Just go learn and support. And I think that will do a lot for us as a movement. I will say, like we've said already, a couple of places to go and get more education and resources. Decolonize Buffalo, the International Anti-Colonial Institute. These are good scarcity podcasts as well. I know Decolonize Buffalo in the chat mentioned other podcasts and sources to go to. Robert Beale's Eurocentrism and the Marxist movement. Definitely recommend checking that out. Read from Indigenous scholars and comrades. Read from them. A.K. Alfred's a great one. Always recommend his work. I found it to be really accessible. It's not explicitly Marxist, but I think that as Marxists, we need to get over that as well. There's different perspectives within Indigenous communities.
Yes.
I think we need to get sort of the full gambit of that perspective or to have an educated perspective. Read Fanon, read Walter Rodney. You have to battle your own settler chauvinism in your own mind, and we can do it together. Join an organization. Online stuff can only get you so far. I'm in CPUSA. If you want to join CPUSA, you can do that. There's obviously other organizations join as well.
Thought this is really great, a great introduction to both topics of decolonial Marxism and also Patsocs, and also a nice little discussion about your debate with the Midwestern Marxist Noah Kretschvik. With that, Matthew, thank you again. I do want to encourage everyone to follow Matthew on Twitter and follow Matthew's YouTube. Those links will be in the chat and also in the replay on YouTube eventually. And also those other resources and accounts as well. All right. Matthew, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for talking with me. I really enjoyed this. Thank you, homie.
Thank you, comrade, and all the comrades in the chat. Have a good one.
The great Dan, he gets everything. He sees what's going on. Thank you, Dan. One of the greats of all time, most powerful men in politics. He controls the internet. The great Dan. Get over here for the cameras, Dan. Get over here.